Hello, everybody. I'm Giulio Quarta, director of the Commons Economy Roadmap. I'm here with Simone,
Hello, everybody.
a dear friend of mine, comrade, and he's an organizational designer involved in a lot of things that he will talk about. And this discussion is about Notion and the change of paradigm that it represents. And we're also going to talk about the politics of these new tools and also alternatives like Anytype, Fileverse, and also softwares around the field of organizational tech like Nextcloud. And will be a bit of a history, present, and future of organizing. Some of these projects that you're going to hear mentioned are also part of the projects in the iteration 2 of the Commons Economy Roadmap, the 99 projects that have been selected. If you want to know more about that, we will leave the link in the description so you can read about them and also vote for the projects that you want to support to be part of the new cohort of projects starting in January 2025. But now we can start. And please, Simone, introduce yourself. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me here. I'm Simone. I was a programmer. Now I'm an organization designer, meaning that I help different kinds of political or like horizontal organizations in general, like democratic organizations, cooperatives, associations, political collectives to work more effectively. And I try to support them with how they take decisions, but also like the software they use or the processes they use. I try to offer, let's say, the full package. And more often than not, no-code software such as Notion, but also others, are part of the deal. So it's stuff I use in my personal life, in my work life, in my consultancies.
Love life.
Love life, they make fun of me, but I still don't do that much. But yeah, when you have a shared Notion workspace, it means the relationship is getting serious. Yes.
So what's the deal with Notion? Why it's so innovative, groundbreaking? What kind of changes that it brought?
It feels weird saying it now because Notion is quite an established software at this point. But my understanding of why it's so popular and especially it's not just the popularity, it's how people relate to it. For me, it's an exception. Like I don't feel about software like that intensely as I do with Notion. That is, I know from the outside it looks cultish. If you go to a meetup, it definitely looks cultish. And I've seen that happen with other software, but I don't know. Notion community is like very strong and it involves people that normally wouldn't react like this to software. My explanation for it is a tiny bit of context, meaning that we have been living for decades now in the long wave of what Apple and Microsoft were doing in the late 80s, early 90s, basically shaping the core ideas that we used to think about software, like files and folder to interact with your data, plus siloed programs that access this data and can do 1, 2, 3 things sometimes, or sometimes you have programs that try to solve 1,000 problems all at once, but still they are somehow packaged as a single thing that you can take and use. Maybe they have options, obviously, to customize a bit the behavior. Maybe they have plugins sometimes to extend the behavior. But let's say the core of the program is always the same and decided by programmers for a specific set of use cases and specific set of features. Notion, as a business proposition, kind of starts from the idea that this approach is very limited and software should be much more customizable. But even more so, like Notion allows you to build a new software for use cases that their programmers, their designers didn't think about. It gives you building blocks to build your own software. So for me, it falls fully in the category of the so-called no-code software that are software to produce other software without using programming languages.
Yeah, I think it's maybe for the listeners, as we are very much into these things and from the outside it can be difficult to understand the interesting parts. I think most of the people think that Notion is a note-taking app, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But it's actually so much more than that. And that's the least interesting part because you can take notes everywhere else.
Yes. That's a bit part of the business strategy of Notion of like presenting itself as like some alternative to Evernote, for example, or like Apple Notes or whatever, or otherwise to Kanban software like Jira or even knowledge management software like Confluence because it's easier to explain. But these are like just specific use cases that you can build on top of Notion. So Notion is much more general. It gives you building blocks. You can do several kinds of software, not any kind of software, because for some things, Notion is not ideal, but like knowledge management, note-taking, personal productivity, business processes are very easy to build on Notion because it's kind of like straightforward. Like these building blocks are like more than enough to do this kind of stuff. For other use cases, it's a bit more convoluted. Like if you want to have a website on Notion, WordPress a better option, so they are not pushing that much. But note-taking is one of the main use cases because it's very easy to do. But that's not the point. It's very important to understand that it's not just a note-taking app on steroid like Obsidian, for example. Obsidian is a knowledge management software mostly for personal usage, and they keep expanding this single domain. But it's a very different approach from Notion that starts bottom up. And
you wrote an article which is very well written, and I invite the readers to read it. It's called Fractal Knowledge for Fractal Futures. And it's a comparison, explanation of Notion, and then a comparison with the other tools. Mm-hmm. So in which it's clear that Notion is capable of doing something that no other tools is currently capable of doing, or to such an extent, or with such a nice UI and so on. So what's the main things that separate Notion from all the competition?
Mm-hmm. Yes. The main thing is what they call fractal knowledge model. That is basically a very simple set of building blocks that Notion uses to do pretty much everything. And these building blocks are, or better, pieces or concepts or, abstractions, if you like, are the page, the block, that it's a bit confusing to call them building block, but like the page, the block, and the database. With that, you can do pretty much everything. And the killer feature of Notion is that, yes, you can have databases, and other tools allow you to build these custom databases. For example, Focalboard, that is the Kanban board of Mattermost. It allows you to specify custom properties or visualize, have different views on the same data, so it's relatively similar. But the killer feature of Notion is that every entry in a database is also a page. And that means that in an entry in a database, you can put whatever you will put in any other page. And this includes other databases. So you can have pages inside databases, inside pages, inside databases, inside pages, and it's not endless. Like at some point, Notion starts complaining, but for most use cases, more than enough. So for example, a very practical application of this, like to move away from the abstract layer, is that, for example, you can have a database of your departments in your organization, and each department page, each entry in the database, it's the same thing. Inside of it, there is all the knowledge, all the information relevant for that department. And this might include databases that are specific to that department. For example, if one department is HR, inside the HR entry in this database, you have the page where you have all the, the guides for onboarding or every process for the HR, but also for example, the list of employees, just to make an example. And the list of employees maybe doesn't make any sense for the IT department or for, the strategic decision making. So it stays in the software exactly in this exact knowledge domain that it belongs to. And this allows for very neat separation of whatever you present to your Notion user or colleagues, or even for your personal usage. Like, it's extremely flexible. And this is a very simple grammar, like composing pages, blocks, and databases enables a lot of expression. It can be compared to what HTML did for web pages, in the sense that you have, especially in the beginning, you have a limited number of tags that could express a lot of visual potential that maybe before was doing with image editing software that is more complicated to use. So yeah.
And then the other thing which I think is very impressive and a big reason of this success is that is a one for all tool. So like you don't need to use 10 different services anymore. But you can either do almost everything on Notion, and the things that you cannot do on Notion, you can integrate them on Notion very neatly. I think it's maybe this is a bit for nerds or for like experts, but there are a lot of trends in business and in tech, which is like interoperability, modularity, composability, things that you mentioned explaining, that I think Notion was able to capture all at the same time in the appropriate moment. And it became like the most shining example of all these new innovations together. And then once you told me that they built the software very fast with a huge team, so like it became like a spaceship, and now it's really difficult to think about an alternative that can achieve what they're achieving now and keep the pace with their rate of like they are releasing features every month, every week we are in a call saying, oh my god, Notion released another thing that is very useful for us. And we are not even the main target, because the main target is like big companies, right?
Not necessarily. Like they try to reach different targets. Like personal productivity is still a good chunk of what Notion does.
Then in terms of revenue generation,
I wouldn't say the way they. I mean, compared to the alternatives, it's less focused on personal productivity than that. Like for example, Obsidian or Anytype are much more like personal usage. Notion tries to reach very big organizations that adopt the tool for sure. I don't think they're sacrificing the individual user. Like I still use it for personal productivity and it's still totally usable. Going back to what you were saying, yeah, they're disruptive because they have a very neat and clean and powerful idea behind, but also the execution. So there's very rare scenarios where there are bugs, like blocking bugs or like problems with service, especially in the last couple of years. Back in the days, there were complaints that it was relatively slow in some scenarios, and it was true. There was a disappearing, like a bug with disappearing workspaces that was not nice, but this kind of stuff is matter of the past. But also they release, the surprising thing is that they release a lot of features very fast without real competitors. Like a lot of what they're doing is somehow novel. They're not incorporating design principles or like features from other competitors that are popping up and might displace them. So they keep pushing new stuff without making the software bloated. And that, I mean, it gets more complex if you want to use all the features. And there are features that maybe you discover after months or years if you are a new user. But it's somehow incremental. It's not overbearing. There's still a not so... Like the barrier to entrance is not so small. Like the first 2-3 hours are not super easy on Notion, but they had never been. Because exactly, we are talking about a new paradigm. And if you take it as a note-taking app, you're like, what the fuck is all this stuff? And so I suggest if you want to get into Notion, still do a little training, either through YouTube videos or with the specialists. I give Notion trainings if you are interested for your organization. But yeah, the first couple hours are a bit complicated. Then the huge amount of features, something you can discover slowly. Still, the execution is surprising, and it's hard to imagine another competitor keep up with this kind of pace of releasing new builds.
And we are not happy about it.
Yeah, we are not happy about it because I wouldn't say it's a monopoly, because they don't have, let's say, a moat that cannot be attacked. But there are at the moment no real alternatives to Notion for organizations. And
yeah, talking about the company, just for context, because sometimes talk about it and people are surprised, but it's already a huge company.
It's a very big company.
Like, it's already at that size that existing big tech cannot buy it out.
No, yeah. I mean, they could.
It's not a big tech, but it's also not a startup since around time.
If I was Google, I would buy Notion.
Me too.
But they have the money to do it. It's still realistic, but I
was surprised that
I wouldn't sell if I was
expecting
Notion.
it to get blobbed up by somebody, but maybe it was too fast.
Microsoft tried to develop its own alternative. Nobody is caring about it. But yeah, no, I don't think, like, Notion now keeps growing. They have no competitor basically, so they would never sell. Like, it would be very stupid. But
And also it's centralized. No, it's not like it's a company with private investors.
yes,
It's not a cooperative. It's not a multi-stakeholder.
Absolutely. It's your run-of-the-mill American startup that made it. And and this is a problem because, first of all, it's an American company. So if your whole organization is built on top of Notion, and I did it multiple times, if for whatever reason the service is suspended, you have no appeal. And this is an existential risk for your organization. This is true of many software, but with Notion even more so, because if, as we were saying before, if you can build a lot of your systems on top of Notion, it's extremely disruptive if it goes down. Like if Google Drive stops working, it's a huge hit to your organization. But imagine if everything, like your CRM, Google Drive, and I don't know, like your chat all go down at the same time. It's that level of disruption if it happens. And if Notion, this is one scenario. Let's say the more political side of it is that being an American company, there can be scenarios where due to embargoes, your country is not allowed to use Notion anymore. I think Iran maybe that cannot access Notion. That is, I don't know what are like. It's weird because sometimes it's for military usage. Sometimes they don't let you use any technology for that. And I was many times in my career, I had to deal with American restrictions on selling software that had no way to be used for military purposes or any kind of stuff when selling it to Iran or whatever. Anyway, going back
also, just a note, I think it's very valuable and interesting also in the job that you do. Like this video is not sponsored by Simone or Robutti, but I want to to promote it. You brought to us this tool, and now in our consulting company, the Commons Economy Roadmap, we are adopting it. And the organizational changes to be realized in the organization, regardless of Notion, and Notion adoption is very connected. You cannot just start using Notion without doing small and medium changes in your organizations.
It depends.
Then I think it's very worthy, and it's some days, some weeks of changes, and then you totally see the differences. But it's not just a new tool. You also have to reprocess it as an organization.
I think this is true of every good organizations should adapt to software, and software should adapt to organizations. And doing the thing together is what makes a good integration between human and technology. And in very big organizations, clearly the adoption of software is the software that needs to fit the organization, because the organization is not going to change. Or in very techno-optimistic and naive spaces, you think the software is the solution, and so your organization tend to follow how the software works. And the power of Notion is that it can adapt to very different organizational structure, while software like file-based, folder-based stuff, or in general very rigid software is good for rigid organizations, very vertical, because you standardize your processes for thousands of people that need to adopt. Let's think of a big corporate. You standardize the process, and the software will follow, either if it's custom or it's Microsoft Word. Somehow there's no need. There's need for flexibility, but it's not part of the deal. And so you don't need a software like Notion. To really make use of Notion, you need this kind of more flexible integration. But this is good on a political level, because it enables different forms of organization that might mirror the values of different kinds of organization. If, for example, you do the decision-making with the idea of empowering workers, the ability to change their own software in a system that is shared by the whole organization is a good thing. If you have a department in your cooperative that takes care, again, of IT, and they want their custom processes internally to their department, the software should follow. And the other department, I don't know, let's think of a cooperative. What do we have in share? Knowledge element production, for example. So the creative part, they have different processes. Their software should adapt to these different processes, and you don't need to use two different tools to do that. For example, the IT department might want to tag something that is going on in the creative department, and they don't need to do, crazy stuff to export data or whatever. So having everything under the same grammar, having everything interoperable inside the organization is good, but then you want each group of worker to be empowered to do things differently. If the software is a barrier to that, it's a problem. And that's where I see the value of Notion also in, I use it in political collectives that don't look like a company, right? So the software that is designed for companies probably won't be good for them. And unless it's very basic stuff, again, like Google Drive or chats might fit, but other stuff more process intensive might assume that there's a manager, for example. I personally build organizations for cooperatives and working full-time workers context without managers. I don't believe they are really necessary. If you do things properly, the software shouldn't assume that there's a manager, for example. And yes.
Yeah, we're talking often also at the beginning about the comparison with the advent of Microsoft and Microsoft Word that set the new standard for how work is done and how we all reason in terms of document and folders. And the open source movement or the anti-corporations movement is now having something which is kind of working, which is Nextcloud, which is the open source alternative. You particularly don't like it.
I don't like it.
I think you don't like it too much. And it took a lot of time because up to some years ago, Nextcloud was a bit or difficult to use or not really palatable for small organization or non-tech people. So if now there is no reason to think the Notion will lose relevance, but actually it will become more and more relevant. What do you see in terms of alternatives? Also, mid-long term, there could be some open source alternative to Notion because it's closed source, of course.
Yes, it's closed source. It's hosted on Amazon servers. It's an American company. You can export the data. They don't put very hard barriers to extract your data. You can do it, but still you don't know where to put them because there's no alternative. So you have a bunch of CSVs and Markdown that you don't know what to do with it. So let's go in order. What you said about Microsoft or in general Windows and Apple operating systems, I call it the dictatorship of the app. That is the idea that software, the natural form of software is a program with a name, with an executable that you can sell. There's the idea that if you give a name to a specific software, let's say Microsoft Word, you can sell it. It starts here, it ends here, it does this specific kind of thing. You pay for it and you can do it. And it's okay, but it's not necessarily the case. Every programmer knows that most software is not an app. Most software is not a program, let's say in the commercial sense. But it can be bits and pieces. It can be a script here connecting to a database sitting somewhere else. And especially in big corporate, you have huge jungles of programs, as in software programs that are mixed together, but maybe they don't have a name as a system, for example, let alone a commercial presence. And so this dictatorship of the app is limiting. It's not necessarily bad. A lot of software is fine if it's shaped like this. But again, it's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and Notion goes beyond it. A lot of the free software and open source movement still followed this logic. Nextcloud didn't invent anything new. It just offered self-hosted version of Google Drive plus, document editors plus calendar plus a bunch of other things. But conceptually, it's the same thing. And it suffers from the same problems, including not being composable. That's the main issue I have with Nextcloud. But we are not here to talk bad about Nextcloud. Let's talk about the future of what could be the future of alternatives to Notion. Or maybe let's start from the present, because a lot of software claim they are alternative to Notion. There is only one alternative to Notion for personal usage that is Anytype, and their claim is valid, meaning that you remember this fractal knowledge model, they do implement the fractal knowledge model. So inside their databases, you can create pages. It's slightly different than Notion. So the conceptual model is a bit richer if you want. So the basic grammar of the software is a bit richer. It's not an alternative for organizations because their multi-user system has been released only recently. It has huge limitations on the commercial offer. On the self-hosting, I don't know how much you can push it because the software itself is designed to be offline first and not to be multi-user. So they added very late into the development. But for personal usage, it's a totally valid alternative to Notion. A lot of other tools like Obsidian, Fileverse that is in the roadmap, or other, there are countless, do claim to be alternatives, but then their databases don't have pages inside. Like a database is a table, it's like an Excel file, no more, no less. And you can embed it in pages, but that's it. There is also Affine that promised to do this, but for what I know, is still not implemented. Affine might become an alternative to Notion, but at the moment it is not. It's cool though because you can draw. Like their pitch, their selling point is like you have a canvas mixed with your pages and blocks and databases. That is something that Notion could benefit from. But yeah, that's it.
And also, it's not only being technically capable of doing the same things, but it should also be
usable.
An organization that has such a marketing capacity to become like also a meaningful alternative in the market, no? And that's even more unthinkable because Notion is so loved, it's such a good AI.
Yes and no, meaning that
if it's a game, it's a very long game, and now we didn't even start. It's not like that there is any reasonable competitor at all.
Yes, it's a long game because the basic set of features you need to compete with Notion is very big. Nonetheless, a lot of organizations are mindful of controlling their data, and Notion does not allow them. And there is definitely a market for sure, not just from hippie programmers or like blockchain hardcore, like let's detach completely from, or free software absolutists, even from basic commercial companies. They start understanding that no control, like no technological autonomy, means an existential threat in many scenarios. And this is becoming more and more true, like with the same perceived narrative of like escaping the cloud and going back to self-hosting or like local servers and all this stuff. That it is a thing. It is a movement, and I think an alternative to Notion could capitalize on that. But nonetheless, nobody seems to be going in that direction. Maybe Anytype might jump on that, but not yet. And so there is a market. What I see also as a potential, this is like, it was also in the article you mentioned, will be to have a way to integrate these Notion workspaces with the workspaces of other organizations. Notion doesn't do that. Like your organization has a workspace and it's a very hard silo. You cannot integrate across workspaces. That is like, you cannot, for example, relate one entry in a database with an entry in a database in another workspace belonging to another organization. This is sometimes useful, like you want to synchronize with other entities without giving them full access to your data, for example. And Notion will never get there. I discussed with some of their product managers, some of their developers, like, no.
So we talked a lot about multiple reasons for why there is not a competitor, and we won't see a meaningful competitor for a lot of years. But now maybe we can touch about the long-term perspective. And I think that what enabled Notion as a tool to emerge is as for many other tools, is the falling cost of organization and communication. Because Notion emerged and is possible out of a lot of small advancements that made the marginal cost of things lower. So then at some point there was like a qualitative shift in which you can collapse a lot of new things or new affordances in a new tool, and that was Notion. But for the same reason, their competitive advantage will also fade out with time. Yeah, I think this was like the explosion moment in which, like, as it often happens, you have one company condensing a lot of things, and then the market catch up. So this is also the process of commodification. So like it's also connected to a capitalist dynamic for which the new capitalist offers something which is better at a cheaper price. And this is good for the new capitalists, but is bad for all the other capitalists and for capitalism in general, because at some point, we are reaching like zero marginal cost for a lot of things. And at some point, like as we are seeing now, it's difficult to profit out of things because everything is become very common. And then you can just profit on intellectual property and properties and assets, but not more on technologies or innovations. So for this, it seems like that in some years, at least the core elements of Notion could be open source, and it will be more and more likely to more and more feasible to do so. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think there are barriers. In fact, Anytype is kind of getting there. The problem is that their business model or like their target is simply not fully overlapping with the one of Notion and with mine. But the people using it are, finding great benefit, and is for personal usage is totally a valid alternative. I don't see. So the main barrier to this that I see is that at the moment there's no specific interest in developing an alternative to Notion, meaning that everybody could benefit from this, but there's no specific group of interest that might pull the money to invest, non-commercially in developing a Notion alternative. Also, the traction of Notion in the bigger scheme of things is just at the beginning, meaning that yes, they have a lot of users, but it's still marginal, and it will take some time for this kind of new mindset to become commonplace in the same way that now everybody knows about folders and files. Anybody using a computer need to know about this. Maybe Zoomer are losing touch with this stuff, but still, it's commonplace. It took 20 years, almost 30 years if you wait for Nextcloud to be usable between when Microsoft released the Office suite plus Windows and when Nextcloud appeared. Also, Google Drive was like 2000, I don't know, 7, 8, something like that, maybe even earlier, I don't remember. And Nextcloud was usable, maybe it's been usable in the last 4 to 5 years. So there was still a huge gap. And
also, 20 years ago, open source tech was much a smaller issue, and there were not so many people pushing for it. And now technology and tech companies are much more at the center of everything. So
yes.
At the point in which there will be a small percentage of the market wanting to create an alternative, it will be much faster, no?
My problem is that since Notion is so, infrastructural to organizations and so cross-cutting in the way it can give value, there's no specific category interested in it. In the same way, it's hard to find a specific group of interest that might develop a new browser. It's highly complex. Nobody's like, I am in charge of doing this. I will have a competitive advantage if I had my own browser, Google did it once and then pretty much, so it's hard to imagine a grassroots interest arising from that. But it might happen.
I have a hot take for you.
Yes.
You can tell me what you think. I think that the crypto space, the cryptocurrencies, the blockchains could be the stakeholder that push for this, because they have this strong ethos of decentralization and they have a bunch of resources. They're not such a big industry, but still is big. And it's honestly a bit appalling. We talk a lot about this with other people, that in the last 5 years, blockchain ecosystems cared a lot about decentralized finance and a lot of decentralized things, but then in terms of software, they still use like Google and Microsoft.
Yes.
And maybe
WhatsApp.
I hope that at some point this discrepancy will be addressed, because it doesn't make sense that we are so purist on certain things and some other things are like, we don't give a shit. So
even more so, I think.
And they have a lot of strong startup culture, the builder culture. And we need a lot of builders and a lot of capital to develop something that is vaguely...
I wouldn't yes, but on top of that, in those spaces, I also see a lot of attention to process quality and like not doing, hard work on like clicking around, whatever. Like processes should be neat. There should be a lot of attention on how you shape your organization, incentives in your organization, so like governance and so on and so forth. And a tool like Notion kind of aligned with that kind of ethos. And so yes, I can agree with this take. Not sure if it's going to happen, but I mean, Anytype is a confirmation of this. Anytype came out of like crypto spaces, basically, like the people there. I don't know. I don't know the full story, but I know they were involved in the crypto space in Berlin and have that kind of background, and they're still connected to it to some degree. So yes, it's potentially that. For sure, it's not gonna come from the traditional free software movement that is very often incapable of framing this, matters of usability and user-oriented approach. So yeah,
if you know something happening in this sense, please let us know. Thank you for listening to this conversation. I hope you find it interesting. Thank you, Simone.
Thank you, Giulio.
I invite you all to follow Simone's work. You have a website where people can reach out.
You can find me on robutti.me. It's my main website. You also find links to my blogs or interviews or articles where I talk about this.
And please subscribe to the Commons Economy Roadmaps newsletter on info.commonseconomy.org. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Bye.